The sun scorched the dunes of Nefud, but it was the heat of shame and despair that burned on my skin. I, Raya al-Rashed, the young woman who read the whispers of the wind and healed with the gifts of the earth, was about to be sold, not for gold, but for a debt that the relentless drought had carved into my family, a debt as deep as the dry wells that had abandoned us. That day, the desert, my home and my soul, became my silent executioner, and what was about to happen, a forced union with a man I didn't even know, would change everything forever. Brace yourself, because the story of how fate can push you toward the most unlikely love begins now. My life until then had been woven in the golden sands, under the vast and merciless sky. Every fiber of my being was Nefud. I had learned to decipher the language of the wind, to find healing in the hardiest herbs, to understand the secrets of the earth that saw me born. My people, the Bedouins, lived in harmony with nature, respecting its cycles, its gifts, and its fury. But the fury that struck us was unprecedented. The drought came, relentless, and took everything: the livestock, the crops, hope itself. And with it came the debt that became an overwhelming shadow over our tent, a threat to our very existence. Then came the news, cold and inevitable as the desert night: an arranged marriage. I, Raya, the desert girl, would be handed over to the powerful Emir Zayd bin Rashid of Doha. His name echoed with power, with a wealth that sounded unreal to my ears accustomed to the silence of the dunes. But with power came reputation. He was known for his coldness, for a relentless grief that had turned him into a distant, almost mythical figure. The tragic loss of his first wife and child had closed off his heart, transforming him into an impenetrable fortress. He was an enigma of pain and authority, and I would be his new wife. A wife by duty, not by affection. Saying goodbye to my Bedouin tent was like a cut to my soul. The smell of Arar wood smoke, the familiar voices, the rough touch of the canvases that had sheltered me my entire life. Every detail engraved itself in my memory like a final farewell. My heart was heavy, so heavy that it felt as if I were dragging the desert sands with me. I knew I was setting off for a world that was the opposite of everything I knew. A palace of marble and gold, where silence would signify opulence, not contemplation. I would be a pawn in a game I did not understand, a stranger in a gilded cage. The journey to Doha was a painful transition, each mile distancing me further from my past and pushing me toward an uncertain future. The familiar dunes gave way to more urban landscapes, mirages of concrete and glass. The rustic tent would be replaced by luxurious chambers, the free desert wind by air conditioning. I was a Bedouin, a woman of the land and sun, and now I would become the wife of an emir, bound by a protocol I barely comprehended. Loneliness began to set in, a profound solitude that even the bustling city ahead could not fill. I was on my way to a loveless marriage, an imposed duty, to a man whose heart was as barren as the land that forced me to leave. Arrival in Doha was not a relief but the confirmation of a gilded prison. Emir Zayd bin Rashid's palace stood like a fortress of ivory and gold, its gleaming walls blinding my eyes. Accustomed to the simple vastness of the desert, every piece of polished marble, every adorned tapestry, every crystal chandelier screamed a wealth that seemed obscene to me, a stark contrast to the dryness that ravaged my homeland. I, Raya al-Rashed, felt like a shadow, an intruder in corridors echoing with centuries of grandeur. Yet to me, they felt hollow. My first meeting with Emir Zayd was as cold as the iciest nights of Nefud. He was tall, imposing, his features marked by an austere beauty that invited no closeness. His eyes, however, were what held me, the abyss of restrained pain, a window to suffering so deep he struggled to hide it from everyone. He greeted me with the formality of a business deal, his words measured, his tone devoid of any warmth. There was no glimpse of curiosity or affection, only the resigned acceptance of duty. I was the bride, the solution to a debt, and nothing more. In that moment I understood that my role was merely to fill a procedural void, not a space in his heart. The days dragged on in the palace, a routine of solitude and observation. My quarters were luxurious, but I missed the scent of sandalwood smoke, the feeling of sand beneath my feet, the freedom of speaking to the wind. I was a stranger, a Bedouin amid silks and jewels. Every step I took watched, every gesture scrutinized. The court viewed me with suspicion, the desert girl who had arrived to take the place of the emir's lost beloved wife. Their whispers were like the dune winds, laden with judgment, but I ignored them, focusing on what had always guided me, attentive listening and keen perception. Over time, I began to decipher the palace's secrets, not through words, but through silences, glances, and the auras of the people. I realized that luxury did not bring happiness, and that the emir's pain was a mirror of the suffering of many there, only deeper, more encapsulated. He shut himself away in his office or in his duties, avoiding any personal contact, turning his absence an insurmountable barrier. But I, who had learned to read between the lines of nature, began to read between the lines of his soul. My sensitivity, my ancestral gift for healing and understanding could not remain idle. It was not my style to confront, but to nurture, soothe, and restore. I started small, almost imperceptibly. One of the youngest servants, Fatima, was frightened by the grandeur of the palace, missing her family. I found her crying in a corner of the garden, and instead of offering advice, I told her stories of the desert, about the courage of the tiny scorpions and the resilience of the acacias. My voice, soft as the murmur of sand, calmed her fears, and her smile, though shy, was my first victory. There was also little Prince Khalid, the emir's nephew, a restless and often sickly child. The palace doctors used their conventional methods, but the boy always seemed feverish, his large eyes sad. One afternoon, as I was walking through the gardens, I heard his faint cry coming from one of the pavilions. I asked permission to see him. The nanny, hesitant, allowed it. I had no sophisticated medicines, but I had knowledge of herbs. With a handful of peppermint and chamomile leaves, I prepared a simple tea, infused with the calm I had learned from the earth. The nanny watched skeptically, but the boy, drawn by the gentle aroma, drank it. The next morning, his fever had subsided, and he slept peacefully, a faint smile on his lips. These small acts initially went unnoticed or were attributed to luck, but they were like seeds planted in arid soil, waiting for the right moment to sprout. I did not seek recognition. I merely followed what my heart and heritage dictated: to care, to ease, to connect. The palace, with its rigidity and protocols, began to feel the gentle breeze of the desert that I carried with me. The curious eyes of some staff started to turn into looks of respect, and the whispers, once malicious, now carried a tone of silent admiration. Meanwhile, the presence of Emir Zaid remained a wall. He was like the highest, most unreachable dunes, guarding secrets and pains beneath his surface. I watched him from afar at formal dinners, at the rare meetings where we were obliged to share the same space. His eyes, once distant, sometimes lingered on me for a moment, a flash of something I could not decipher. Was it curiosity, irritation, or perhaps just a fleeting reflection of his own melancholy? I didn't know, but I knew that my purpose there was not just duty. It was to find a way to reach that heart of stone, to show that even in the most barren lands, life can bloom again. And for that, I would need more than subtlety. I would need a moment, an incident that would reveal to him the true strength of the woman he had married. The moment arrived, not with a thunderclap, but with the chilling whisper of fear that spread through the marble halls. Little Prince Khalid, the very same one I had helped with a chamomile tea, was struck by a relentless illness. It was no ordinary fever, but a malady that consumed him swiftly, stealing his color, energy, and life itself. His eyes, once sad, now burned with delirium, and his fragile body trembled with uncontrollable spasms. The palace physicians, respected and experienced men, were baffled, their remedies and diagnoses failing one after another. Despair hung in the air, as thick as the incense smoke that tried in vain to purify the boy's chamber. The news hit me like a sharp pang. I was not his mother, yet my Bedouin heart felt the child's pain, the helplessness of those around him. My soul, accustomed to seeking solutions from the earth, could not remain idle. With a courage I did not know I possessed, I made my way to the prince's quarters, where turmoil and panic were palpable. The chief doctor, a man with a graying beard and a severe gaze, barred my way. "Princess Raya, this is no place for a desert woman. The palace methods are complex." But I insisted, my voice low but resolute. "My life has been woven in healing, in observation. Allow me to try. What is there to lose?" Emir Zaid was there, a statue of anguish and restrained fury. His eyes, usually distant, were now bloodshot with pain as he watched his nephew. He looked at me, a mixture of skepticism and a spark of something I could not identify. Perhaps the memory of the tea that eased Khalid's fever weeks before. Let her try. His voice was hoarse, an order that silenced all protests. It was a slim chance, a thread of hope in a chasm of despair. Entering the room, I felt the heavy energy, the sickness gripping the boy. I examined Khalid carefully, not with scalpel or stethoscope, but with gentle hands, sensing the feverish heat, the weak pulse. His glazed eyes stared back at me, unrecognizing. While the doctor spoke of viruses and complex infections, I saw something deeper, an imbalance that the herbs of my land could soothe. I requested herbs that grew at the desert's edges, roots that few knew, and fresh water from a specific well that I knew had purifying properties. There was resistance, of course. Desert herbs? That's witchcraft, whispered a courtier. But the emir's word was law. I transformed the room into a small oasis of healing. I prepared infusions with the herbs they brought me, with a gentle aroma that contrasted with the strong smells of the medicines. I made cold compresses with scented waters, sang desert lullabies about the strength of life and the peace of the stars, and told stories of underground rivers flowing beneath the dunes, bringing life where there seemed to be none. I was not just healing his body, but also his soul, his connection to the earth, to life. I spent sleepless days and nights, my presence constant by the boy's side, watching every breath, every tremor. I felt his energy, the struggle, the will to live. Emir Zaid, who had previously kept his distance, began to observe, first from afar, then closer. Standing in the doorway, he saw my unwavering dedication, the patience with which I applied the herbs, the sweetness in my voice as I whispered to the boy. He saw that I did not shrink from the illness but met it with a calmness that seemed impossible amid so much chaos. His eyes, once so dull with pain, began to show a new light, a mixture of astonishment and growing curiosity. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the miracle began to happen. Khalid's fever subsided. His breathing, once labored, became softer and more regular. One morning he opened his eyes and, for the first time in days, recognized me. A faint smile appeared on his pale lips. At that moment, the air in the room grew lighter, and a collective sigh of relief echoed through the palace. The emir's doctors, once skeptical, now looked at me with an almost reverential respect. They could not explain what had happened, but the results were undeniable. Zaid entered the room, steps lighter than I had ever seen him take. He approached his nephew's bed, and his eyes met mine. There was no longer coldness or formality. The wall of pain that surrounded him seemed to crack, revealing a flash of gratitude and a raw emotion that caught me off guard. "You saved him," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper, but carrying a depth that he had never before directed at me. It was not just a matter of duty now. He saw me, not as the arranged wife, the Bedouin, but as the woman who had brought life back to his nephew, who had defied death with her wisdom and compassion. In that look, in those words, I felt the first crack in his stone heart, a sign that perhaps the desert seed could bloom even in such barren soil. In that gaze, in those words, I felt the first crack in his stone heart, a sign that perhaps the desert seed could bloom even in such arid soil. Emir Zaid's gratitude was not a simple thank you. It was the ajar door to an abyss of pain I had already glimpsed. He didn't become a different man overnight, but the coldness that surrounded him lessened, like the morning fog dissipating under the sun. He began to watch me, not with the distant formality of before, but with a silent intensity that made me feel his presence even when he was on the other side of the hall. At dinners, his eyes lingered on me, searching for something I still didn't know how to name. I, for my part, continued to weave my silent magic through the palace. The desert stories still soothed the children, the herbs healed the servants' small ailments, and my presence, once exotic, was beginning to become an accepted, even welcomed part of the palace's tapestry. One afternoon, I found Emir Zaid in the garden, standing before a withered rosebush. His face was more exposed to the sunlight than usual, and I could see the line of his clenched jaw, his eyes fixed on the dry petals. He didn't notice me immediately. I approached, and the scent of the dried roses seemed to carry an ancient mourning. "The desert roses," I said softly, not wanting to startle him. They teach us that beauty can arise from barrenness, but they need constant care not to wither. He turned, surprise in his eyes quickly replaced by his usual reserve, but without the coldness from before. This rose bush was planted by my wife, he murmured, his voice almost inaudible, a thread of pain breaking through each syllable. She loved life, beauty, and I couldn't protect them. The confession came like a whisper of wind, laden with guilt and a sadness so deep it seemed to suffocate the air around us. In that moment he was not the powerful emir, but a man broken by the past, an echo of the pain I had felt leaving my land. I offered no empty words of comfort. Instead, I gently touched one of the withered leaves. The earth teaches us that life goes on, Emir, that loss is part of the cycle, but not the end. There is always a seed, a root that endures, waiting for the chance to bloom again. My eyes met his, and at that moment, I caught a glimpse of his shattered soul. The pain of losing his wife and child was a burden he bore alone, a wall that kept him from moving forward. He recoiled, as if my emotional closeness were a threat. "You don't understand," he said, his voice hardening once more, the barrier rising again. "Some voids cannot be filled. Some losses are absolute." He stepped away, leaving me alone with the withered rosebush, and the feeling that, despite the crack, the stone heart was still far from fully opening. I felt the weight of my own story, the debt that bound me there, my own lost home. We were two strangers, united by duty, each carrying our burden, and I wondered if he would ever see me beyond my role. The days that followed were a test. Zaid, after that moment of vulnerability, withdrew even further. His initial indifference, which I thought had lessened, seemed to return with renewed force, almost as a defense. He avoided me, his glances now brief and almost guilty. I felt invisible again, a decorative piece in his palace, and the loneliness that had followed me since Nefud came back with greater intensity. I began to question my purpose, wondering if my presence there was truly a healing or just a constant reminder of his losses. But the palace was a nest of intrigue, and my growing influence, subtle as it was, did not go unnoticed. Tradition was a silent tyrant, and the desert girl who dared to heal and soothe with ancestral methods was seen with suspicion by some. Zaid's aunt, the family matriarch, a woman with a piercing gaze and authoritative voice, was among the most skeptical. She saw me as a threat to the established order, a stranger who might destabilize the lineage. A staged incident, perhaps orchestrated by her or one of her allies, placed me in a delicate position. A valuable family jewel, an emerald brooch belonging to Zaid's mother, mysteriously disappeared. Veiled accusations began, whispers spreading like wildfire. My reputation, already fragile within the court, was at stake. I was the outsider, the Bedouin, and to many, the most likely culprit. I was summoned to the emir's presence in the throne room, where my aunt and other members of the court were already gathered, their faces heavy with judgment. Zaid, seated on his throne, appeared impenetrable, his eyes dull. Zaid's aunt, with a tone of feigned concern, questioned my presence in the palace, my humble origins, insinuating my unfamiliarity with the customs and ethics of the court. The air was thick, and I felt the ground give way beneath my feet. It was time to defend myself, to fight for my honor. The honor of a desert woman is not in jewels, but in her actions and the truth of her heart, I said, my voice low but resonating with the strength of the dunes. I did not take the jewel, and if you allow me, I can find the truth. There were laughs and murmurs of disdain, but Zaid, who until then had remained silent, raised his hand, silencing everyone. He looked at me, and in that moment, I saw not indifference but a spark of recognition, a hesitation that gave me strength. "How would you do that, Princess Raya?" he asked, his voice deep. I explained my method not as a detective but as an observer. Where the jewel was last seen, who was there, the energies I felt when touching the objects. It seemed madness to them, but to me it was the language of the world. To everyone's surprise, Zaid allowed me to try, granting me a day to uncover the truth. I spent hours in the room where the jewel disappeared, touching every object, feeling the vibrations. It was not sorcery, but a sharpened intuition, a connection with the environment that the desert had taught me. I knelt, feeling the ground, the wood. I knelt down, feeling the floor, the wood beneath me. My fingers traced the gaps, searching not for the object itself but for the story the room told. The missing jewels chamber was a sanctuary of luxury, yet beneath the golden gleam, I sensed fear, envy, and a subtle web of lies. It wasn't the energy of a violent theft, but of a guarded secret, a veiled intent. My eyes settled on a small toy chest, forgotten in a corner. It seemed out of place, an island of innocence amid the pomp. I opened it, and among silk dolls and lead soldiers, my fingers touched something cold and hard. The emerald brooch was there, clumsily hidden as if by small, inexperienced hands. It wasn't a thief, but a child, perhaps used unknowingly, or acting out of misdirected innocence. The energy emanating from the brooch and the chest was not one of malice, but of confusion and slight panic. The truth unfolded in my mind, clear as desert water after a storm. Someone had used a child to hide the jewel, knowing the blame would fall on the outsider, on me. With the brooch in hand, I returned to the throne room. The air felt heavier still, laden with expectation and silent condemnation. Zaid's aunt wore a triumphant smile, her eyes fixed on me, anticipating my humiliation. Zaid remained seated on his throne, his expression unreadable, though I noticed the tension in his posture. "I found the brooch," I announced, my voice echoing through the vast chamber. I raised the jewel, which glittered under the light. A murmur rippled through the room. "Where? In your chambers, perhaps?" Zaid's aunt sneered, her voice sharp as a blade. "No, Your Eminence," I replied, keeping my gaze steady on hers. "It was in the small toy chest belonging to little Ali, the son of the servant Fatima, naively hidden like a child's treasure." Shock swept through the court. Zaid's aunt went pale, her smile faltering. "A child? Impossible. He would know nothing of the value of such a piece." "Perhaps not its monetary value," I countered, "but the value of an adventure, of a secret. Children are easily influenced, Your Eminence, especially by those who promise them a sweet or a compliment in exchange for an innocent game." My eyes met Zaid's, and for a moment, I saw understanding flicker. Within them, he knew. He understood the veiled insinuation, the truth behind my words. Zaid's aunt tried to protest, her voice rising, but Zaid raised his hand, a gesture that silenced everyone. He stepped down from the throne, his footsteps firm and resolute. He stopped in front of me, took the brooch from my hands, and examined it. His eyes, once dull, now blazed with an intensity he had never before directed at me. "Princess Raya has not only proven her innocence, but has revealed an inconvenient truth," he said, his deep, powerful voice echoing throughout the room. "Intrigues and manipulations will not be tolerated in my palace. Those who use the innocence of a child to sow discord and slander will be severely punished." He looked directly at his aunt, and the challenge in his gaze was unmistakable. "My wife, Princess Raya, has brought not only healing to my nephew but clarity to this household. She is a woman of honor and wisdom, and her word will carry equal weight to mine on matters of justice within this palace." It was a public declaration, a breach of protocol, a direct affront to those trying to diminish me. Zaid's aunt retreated, her face twisted in silent fury. The court was in shock. The whispers were now of astonishment and respect. Zaid, the distant and cold emir, had defended me, elevated me, risking the wrath of his own family and deep-rooted traditions. In that moment, I felt a mixture of relief and a strange melancholy. He saw me. He defended me. But the hostility of the court, the ease with which I was accused, the intrigue that almost brought me down, all made me feel the vast distance between my world and his. I was the Bedouin, the outsider, and even with the emir's protection, I knew I would never be truly accepted by many there. That palace, with its opulence and unspoken rules, was a battlefield. That night, loneliness enveloped me more intensely than ever before. The victory was hollow. I was safe, my honor intact, but the price felt too high. The weight of those marble walls, the judgmental glances, the constant need to prove my worth, it all suffocated me. I sat on the balcony of my quarters looking at the distant lights of Doha, so different from the stars that lit the Nefud desert. That day, Zaid had defended me, yes, but I wondered how long he could fight against a world that saw me as an intruder. Doubt began to eat away at my soul. What was I doing there? My life was tied to a man I barely knew, in a place that didn't belong to me. surrounded by people who hated me. My family's debt was paid, but at what cost to my own soul? The image of my tent, the scent of the arwera tree, the freedom of the wind haunted my thoughts. I could go back. I could find a way to live in Nefud, away from the ostentation and veiled cruelty. The choice presented itself, impossible in its simplicity. Stay and fight for a place that might never truly be mine, or run away, give up everything, and embrace the familiar solitude of the desert. Zaid's mistake, his initial indifference, not seeing me as more than a deal, echoed within me. Even now, with his public defense, I felt invisible in his grandeur, a piece in his game of power. His protection was a shield, but not a hug. I needed more than that. I needed recognition that went beyond duty, beyond gratitude. I needed a home, love, partnership. And I wondered if, in his stone heart, he was capable of giving something like that. That incident, which should have elevated me, actually pushed me to the edge of an abyss where I questioned if it was worth continuing. The dramatic twist was not only the exposure of the intrigue, but the revelation of my own fragility, my willingness to give up everything. The choice was mine, and its weight was overwhelming. The weight of the choice was overwhelming, but the answer, as painful as it was, began to take shape in my heart. I could no longer endure invisibility, the sensation of being a shadow in a palace that, despite all its grandeur, offered me no home. That night, beneath stars dimmed by the city lights, I made a silent decision. I would return to Nefud. The debt was paid, my honor intact, but my soul yearned for the desert, for freedom, for the truth of who I was. Little did I know that fate had other plans, and that nature itself would conspire to trap me in that place, forcing me to see and be seen. The next day, an unexpected sandstorm rising from the heart of the desert swept through Doha. It was not a breeze, but a golden fury that swallowed the sun, turning the blue sky into an oppressive orange cloak. The palace, with its double windows and thick walls, became a fortress against the rage outside. Yet the fine sand, like persistent whispers, crept through every crack, covering luxury with a veil of dust. I was caught in the garden, trying to salvage some rare herbs I had planted. The wind lashed my face, the sand burned my skin, and visibility was almost nil. I crouched down, protecting the most fragile seedlings, when a strong hand grabbed my arm. It was Zaid. His eyes, once distant, were now wide with concern, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. "Raya, what are you doing here? It's dangerous." He pulled me inside an adjoining pavilion, a small refuge of marble and latticework that soon became our gilded prison. The heavy wooden door shut with a dull thud, and the sound of the storm was muffled, turning into a distant roar. The dimness enveloped us, only the faint light of an oil lantern illuminating his marked features, sand speckled in his dark hair. The air was dense, heavy, and the silence that followed the closing door was almost as deafening as the storm. I was forced to stay there, isolated with the emir, the man who had saved me and wounded me with his indifference. He watched me, and this time, there was no formality, nor the previous barrier. The fury of the storm seemed to have stripped away his defenses, revealing the man behind the title. He looked exhausted, his shoulders slumped, a vulnerability I had never witnessed before. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice hoarse, almost a lament. "No one should be out there in that fury." His eyes drifted away, fixating on an invisible point on the wall, as if reliving a nightmare. "Life is a storm, Emir," I replied, my voice soft but steady. "Sometimes we have to face it to protect what we love, even if the sand blinds us." He finally looked at me, and the pain in his expression was so palpable it nearly made me recoil. "I couldn't protect mine," he confessed, his voice barely audible, a thread of pain breaking through. "My wife, my son, the storm took them, and I was there, but I was powerless." It was the first time he spoke so openly about his loss, and the flood of guilt and despair radiating from him was overwhelming. He sat down on a stone bench, his head in his hands, his back bent under the weight of years of grief. He was no longer the powerful, distant Emir, but a broken man, haunted by the ghosts of the past. My anger, my feeling of invisibility, all dissolved in the face of his anguish. I saw him not as my husband by duty, but as a shattered human being. I sat beside him, keeping a respectful distance, yet my presence was a silent invitation. "The desert sand takes But it also reveals, Emir, I said, my voice a soft whisper. It takes the old, what no longer serves, but uncovers truths, forgotten paths. Your pain is real, Zaid, and there is no shame in it. I used his name for the first time, an intimacy that broke down another barrier. He lifted his head, his eyes red and watery. I can't love again, Raya. It would be a betrayal of their memory. Every time I feel a glimpse of happiness, guilt consumes me. I feel like I'm forgetting them, abandoning them. His confession was a river of sorrow, and I understood the depth of his fortress. He wasn't cold by nature, but by fear. Fear of feeling, fear of losing again, fear of betraying a love he believed to be irreplaceable. Love is not a container that empties to be filled again, Zaid. I corrected him, my voice laden with the wisdom that life in the desert had taught me. He is like the oasis. It can dry up, but the underground water remains, waiting to spring forth in a new place, in a new form. To love again is not to forget the past. It is to honor it with the continuity of life. It is to allow their memory to be a garden, not a grave. I gently touched his hand, a gesture both comforting and challenging. Your scars are not weaknesses, Zaid. They are proof that you have loved deeply, and they can be the bridge to a new love, a love that carries the wisdom of what was lost, but flourishes in the light of the present. My eyes met his, and in that instant, something changed. The wall that surrounded him not only cracked but crumbled into pieces. He held my hand, his grip firm, and a tear rolled down his face. I treated you with indifference, he admitted, his voice heavy with remorse. I did not see you. I was so blinded by my own pain that I failed to see the extraordinary woman you are. Your strength, your compassion, your wisdom, they are like the water the storm brings to the arid desert. In that moment, Zaid did not just see me. He recognized me, not as the arranged wife, the solution to a debt, but as a partner, a soul who could understand his pain and help him find a path to healing. The sandstorm outside continued to howl, but inside the pavilion a sacred silence fell, filled with truth and vulnerability. It was the beginning of something new, something I, in my pain and loneliness, had given up hoping for. The storm had subsided, but the tempest within our hearts had calmed. That pavilion, once a prison, had become the cradle of a new truth. Zaid, the once impenetrable Emir, now looked at me with a veiled tenderness, a genuine remorse that melted the last barriers within my own heart. His indifference, which had wounded me deeply, had been replaced by a careful, almost reverent attentiveness. He did not ask for forgiveness with words, but through gestures, a lingering glance, a subtle touch on my hand during a formal dinner, the way he spent more time in my chambers, not out of duty, but simply to be there, sharing the silence or the stories of my desert. I, Raya, who had planned my escape, now found myself anchored by a feeling I dared not name. Each day, I watched him wrestle with the ghosts of the past, with the guilt that haunted him. And instead of pulling away, I felt a profound desire to help him bear this burden. We began visiting the grave of his first wife and child, not in secret but together. I observed his silent mourning, and rather than jealousy, I felt deep empathy. Those were not rivals but parts of his story, and I helped him understand that honoring the past did not mean living in it. My herbs and stories healed not only bodies, but souls, and Zaid's soul needed a balm that only acceptance could offer. The court, of course, watched this change with a mixture of astonishment and disapproval. Zaid's aunt, in particular, refused to accept that the desert girl had claimed so central a place in the emir's heart. Her intrigues did not cease, but Zaid no longer allowed them to affect me. He became my shield, my defender, not merely out of duty, but by conscious choice. In a council meeting, when the aunt tried to undermine my influence by suggesting my Bedouin methods were primitive, Zaid interrupted her with a calm authority that silenced everyone. Raya's wisdom, he declared, comes from a source as ancient and pure as the very dunes. She has brought healing and clarity to this palace, and whoever doubts her ability doubts my own vision. It was a public declaration of loyalty, a recognition worth more than any jewel. The months turned into years. 3 years have passed since that sandstorm that changed the course of our lives. The palace, once a labyrinth of loneliness for me, now resonated with the life I had helped nurture. Zaid was no longer the emir with a heart of stone. He smiled more, listened more, and his leadership, though still firm, was infused with a compassion that inspired his subjects. He had abandoned some of the excessive luxury, redirecting resources toward community projects, the education of Bedouin children, and the creation of sustainable oases in the desert, a silent tribute to my origins and my passion for the land. I, for my part, flourished. With Zayd's unwavering support, I fulfilled my dream of founding a center of healing and wisdom, not just for the court, but for the entire people of Doha. There, ancient Bedouin practices, herbal knowledge, and soul-healing stories were taught and applied. Women of all ages came seeking advice, remedies, and a sense of community I had long missed. The center was a bridge between the desert and the city, a place where simplicity met grandeur, and where healing blossomed from the earth and the heart. Zayd often visited me, watching with pride the women I helped, and his eyes, once filled with pain, now shone with a light of purpose and happiness. Our union, which had begun as a duty, had transformed into a deep partnership, a love that defied conventions. Zayd's scars from the past did not disappear, but he learned to carry them with dignity, integrating them into his new reality, allowing them to make him more human, more empathetic. And I, the desert girl, found a home, not just in a palace, but in the heart of a man I once believed to be unattainable. That love, which he feared would betray the memory of his family, became, in truth, the greatest tribute to them, the proof that life, even after the most devastating loss, can be reborn in an even deeper beauty. And the future? The future. It manifested itself in small steps, in laughter echoing through the palace corridors. One day, while I was in the garden teaching little Fatima, the servant I had comforted with desert stories about the properties, healing from a rare flower, a small being of energy and curiosity approached. She was a girl, with bright eyes and hair as dark as Zayd's, but with the wide smile and innate curiosity I saw in myself. Our daughter, Layla. She nestled into my lap, and Fatima, now a young woman, smiled, showing Layla how to touch the flower with respect. It was the fusion of two worlds, two souls, two legacies, the wisdom of the desert united with the grandeur of the city, a heritage of compassion and strength blossoming within each of us. Zayd appeared, watching the scene from afar, a gentle smile on his lips. He needed no words to express what he felt. His gaze, once burdened with the pain of a lost past, now radiated the joy of a lived present and the hope of a future built with love. The dunes which once forced me to leave now called me back, not as a refuge of solitude, but as the source of my strength, which I could share with my family and my people. Life, after all, was a cycle, and I had found my place in it, beside the Emir, my love, my partner. Yet palace life, even with all its love and purpose, was never entirely free of challenges. One day, while Layla played with Ali, Zayd's nephew now grown and healthy, I observed a scene that made me reflect. A young courtier, newly arrived from a distant province, tripped and spilled a tray of fine sweets onto an incredibly expensive Persian rug, right at Zayd's aunt's feet. The panic in his eyes was palpable, the same I had felt years before. Zayd's aunt, with a mocking smile that didn't reach her eyes, pointed to the stained carpet. "Incompetence, is this the level of service we now allow in our palace? A disgrace." Her voice, always sharp, cut through the air, and the young courtier shrank back, expecting the severe punishment that traditionally followed. But Zayd, my Zayd, did not react with the anger or indifference of before. He approached the carpet, observing the spilled sweets. A slight smile played on his lips. "Haste is the enemy of perfection, young one, but a carpet can be cleaned. A reputation, however, is much harder to restore." He looked at the courtier, and in his eyes there was no condemnation, but an understanding born from his own journey of mistakes. "Stand up. Help clean this up and learn to be more patient. The true wealth of a palace lies not in its possessions, but in the integrity of its people." I stepped forward, with Layla still in my arms, and touched the young man's shoulder. The dunes teach us that even after a storm, the sand settles and life finds a new path. A stumble does not define your journey, but the way you rise. Fatima, who had grown up under my care and was now one of the main caregivers of the palace children, promptly brought cloths and water to assist the young man. Zayd's aunt, frustrated by the lack of drama and punishment, tried to argue, but her power had drastically diminished. The palace was no longer a place of fear and intrigue for everyone, but a home where compassion and justice were beginning to flourish under Zaid's leadership and the subtle yet powerful influence of my presence. That day, as I watched my husband and daughter, I understood that the family debt that had brought me to this place, the arranged marriage that had seemed a burden, was no mistake. No, it was fate, disguised as misfortune, pushing me to where I needed to be, to the man I needed to heal, who in turn would heal me. My journey, from a Bedouin tent to Queen of the Desert and the Palace, was a tapestry woven with threads of loss, resilience, and a love reborn from ashes. Zaid, who had once been a stone-hearted emir, was now a leader who ruled with wisdom and empathy, his scars not more than a burden, but a constant reminder of the depth of his capacity to love. He had learned that love does not diminish with loss but transforms, expands, embracing new forms and new beginnings. And I, Raya, the guardian of the dunes, found my purpose not only in healing the land, but in healing hearts, building bridges between worlds that seemed irreconcilable. Our story, the story of the Bedouin woman and the emir, became a legend whispered in the desert sands and the palace corridors, proof that true love is not found in the comfort of familiarity, but often in the arid lands of the unexpected, where faith and compassion can transform duty into a glorious destiny. Every step we took, every challenge we overcame, led us to a legacy of hope, where the ancient wisdom of the desert merged with the vision of a prosperous and just kingdom. My connection to the sands of Nefud, which once dictated my escape, was now the foundation of my strength, a gift I shared with my family and the people of Doha, uniting two worlds in harmony. And so, life continued, an eternal cycle of loss and renewal, but now with a new melody. I learned that life's greatest twists often disguise themselves as catastrophic mistakes, doors that close, paths that seem to lead only to pain. But it is in those moments of darkness that the true strength of our soul is tested, and it is when we discover that fate, with its mysterious wisdom, is pushing us toward the deepest rightness of all. The union of a widowed emir and a young Bedouin woman, of a marble palace and a tent in the desert proved that love knows no borders or barriers. It flourishes where least expected, transforming obligation into choice, loneliness into partnership, and pain into an inexhaustible source of compassion. Sometimes, the greatest mistake we believe we have made, or the most challenging circumstance imposed on us, is fate pushing us toward the most unexpected and beautiful rightness of our lives. And you? Have you ever stopped to think about your greatest mistake that ended up becoming an unforgettable rightness? Share your story in the comments. If you were moved by this journey of love and overcoming, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming inspiring stories.